Saga from Azerbaijan. The Story of Bottom. Chapter 1. Bottom and Dervish. Once upon a time, in antiquity, there was a very poor man called Bottom. He was so poor that didn't even have a hat, where he could seek for shelter from the cold and bad weather. In the summer, he slept on the street, under any cover or in the open sky. But now, winter was near and the poor Bottom would have to endure all inclemency of that season. Finally, our poor man decided to make a cave for himself. He went to some inhabitants and asked them to lend him a pickaxe and a shovel. By compassion, they did not deny him the request. Bottom returned then with the tools, chose a well-suited place and began to dig. He had already arrived at a certain depth, when, suddenly, struck something that, immediately, noticed that there were 7 pots of clay full of gold. His joy had no limits. He pulled out a handful of gold, covered the pots with the earth already extracted and went to the city center. There he sold the gold and, with the money he had raised, he contracted workers and ordered them to set up, around that place, a high wall. Then, he adjusted engineers and constructors and, offering them a good sum of money, ordered them to construct a building that, by its grandeur and beauty, would overtake all the other of that region. The work took place for a whole year and the result was a so wonderful building that travelers who passed through there stopped to contemplate it and were full of admiration. The city residents, on the other hand, were amazed by such event, but as more as they looked for, they couldn't find an explanation for it. For, the same person, that before walked around begging for handouts, was now the richest man in the city. But, when they asked him where he had gotten so much money, Bottom used to respond saying, "You well know, that I always lived in the most extreme poverty, bearing with patience the cold and the hunger and still many other evils. And, rather than complain, I praised Allah. And Allah, taking pity on me and admiration for my great patience, sent me riches, and thus transformed the darkness of my difficult days in luminosity." Then, as a sign of his gratitude to Allah, that made him worthy of such wealth, Bottom ordered them to build, next to that building, another building of special character, containing 7 doors. And, when the beggars came to him in search of their alms, these were distributed in an organized way, through these 7 doors. Once, among those who came to Bottom, there was a dervish. Generally, as soon as they received their alms, the beggars went away immediately, taking each one their road. But the dervish stood there, and Bottom then asked, "Haven't you received your alms, dervish? Or are you waiting for something else? If you are waiting for something else, tell me then what it is, that you will receive it immediately." "I'm not waiting for anything," said the dervish. "In my whole life, I have always traveled, and I'm now going to the west. But, when I arrived in this city, I wanted to meet the people, and to know how they lived. Then I saw in a square a crowd of beggars as preparing to go somewhere. I asked them where they were going and they told me that since in the city there was a very rich man called Bottom, who had built a house especially for the poor, where they could go to receive their alms, that was where they were going. I then followed them, and so I got to you. In this town, I don't know anyone. So, I ask you, by kindness, to let me spend the night in your home for the poor, so that, tomorrow morning, I can resume my wanderings around the world." The dervish's request was not denied, and, in the conversation they had at night, Bottom wanted to know everything he had seen around the world he had visited. The dervish's account left Bottom very impressed, and, at the end of the conversation, he said, "A few years ago, I ordered to build this home for the poor. Every day, hundreds of beggars come here to receive their alms, and I give money to everyone, through these 7 doors. And since you, in your wanderings through different countries, met a lot of people, tell me something. Have you ever seen, somewhere in the world, someone like me? To that, the dervish replied, you are really very generous, and help the poor. But I met a person who, in generosity, surpasses you. In the reign of Shah lives a man named Furbad. Every week, he organizes banquets and to them invites poor and beggars. At mealtime, he orders to serve the pilaf, which is a typical food of the Persians, in golden plates with golden lids, one for every 2 visitors. And, after the meal, everyone wins, through a raffle, the golden plate or the golden lid, as a gift from the owner of the house. Bottom was so impressed with what he had just heard that got astonished, as if he had lost his voice. Before, he was proud just to imagine that there was nowhere else in the world someone who, in generosity, could even approach him. But now, he was convinced that, indeed, Furbad was more generous than him. And so, he said to the dervish, such an extraordinary man I want to see with my own eyes. Therefore, early tomorrow, I will travel to the city where Furbad lives. But, before that, I want to make you 2 requests. First, that you change your clothes with me. Second, that you stay in my place until I return, distributing the alms to the poor the way I do. Then, he gave to Dervish the key of the trunk, where the money was kept, and went to prepare for the trip the next day. End of chapter 1.